Vienna, January 1867. The kind of cold that turns breath into ghosts and silence into something you can almost touch. The imperial palace rises against a white sky. Inside, 500 candles burn without apology. The marble floors hold the reflection of everything Vienna believes about itself, its power, its permanence, its absolute certainty about who belongs and who does not. The doors open. A woman walks in. Forest, green wool. A birthmark running the length of her right cheek uncovered. A document bound in plain black cloth held under one arm. No name on the cover. No ornament. Nothing that announces itself. She was sent away 3 years ago. Quietly. Politely. The way you remove something inconvenient before it learns to ask the right questions. She kept asking. Across the room, a countess watches. White hair, perfectly arranged. Silver silk. The expression of a woman who has written this scene before and knows exactly how it ends. She is very certain. She should not be. The woman keeps walking. The day they buried Frederick Ashbourne, Vienna was doing what Vienna always did. Being beautiful. Being indifferent. Being utterly magnificently itself. The October sky sat low and pewter gray over the 3rd District Cemetery. The trees had already surrendered their leaves. They stood bare and correct along the path like mourners who had arrived early and run out of things to feel. The horses pulling the hearse were black naturally. The priest spoke in Latin naturally. And the widow stood at the edge of the grave in dark wool and did not cry. That was Eleanor Ashbourne, 31 years old, 5 feet and 7 inches of composed stillness in a city that preferred its women smaller. Auburn hair pinned so tightly at the temples that she could feel the pull of it. Amber eyes that did not look at the coffin, that looked continuously and with great precision at the woman standing across the grave. Countess Helena Voss, 62 years old, white hair arranged with the mathematical confidence of someone who has never in her adult life been caught unprepared. Silver blue silk, which was an unusual choice for a funeral. But Helena had decided somewhere in the previous 4 decades that the rules of propriety were for people who still needed them as scaffolding. Her black eyes moved across the small assembled crowd, the way a jeweler moves a loop across stones. Not for beauty, for usefulness. She cried at the appropriate moment. Eleanor watched her cry and thought, there is no grief here. There is performance. And performance requires an audience, and the audience today is me. She looked back at the coffin. Frederick, a reasonable man in the limited, specific way that phrase can be true, 22 years older than her. Distracted in the particular manner of men who have organized their entire interior life around systems that reward a certain narrowness of focus. He had not been cruel. He had been absent. Which Eleanor had learned over 3 years of marriage was its own particular kind of diminishment, not the loss of someone taken from you, the loss of someone who was never quite present enough to be taken. She had married him at 28, because the Harwick name remained, and the Harwick money had not. And Frederick Ashbourne had the estate, and the title and the social architecture that a woman without alternatives needs, the way a climbing plant needs something to grow against. She had understood the exchange. She had accepted it without illusion. She had even found in certain small domestic moments something she could honestly call warmth. Then his heart had given way in January. The doctor, a man named Brower, recommended, as it happened by Helena, prescribed a regimen of rest and specific medicines that Frederick followed precisely, and still declined. 4 weeks. Just gone. And now the dirt was falling, and Helena Voss was already moving. Eleanor noticed it within the week. Not a dramatic shift. A river does not announce when it changes course. You notice weeks later that the water has been going somewhere different. Quietly. With purpose. While you were looking at something else. Helena had always been the woman people leaned toward. She spoke at a volume that required her listeners to incline forward slightly. That small, barely visible bow of the head and shoulders that is itself a kind of surrender. Helena collected those surrenders the way other women collected cameos, without appearing to try, without ever acknowledging what she was doing. But now the leaning was about Eleanor. Eleanor heard it in pieces. Window seats and bookshelf positions were her education. She had learned growing up in a family where every social occasion was a survival exercise to position herself in rooms like a chess piece. Present, functional, overlooked. And so she heard the sentences people were not directing at her. The poor dear, and with no children to anchor her. That mark on her cheek. I've always felt such sympathy. These things do make social navigation so much more. Frederick's death was a shock, of course, but, she never quite settled into Viennese life, did she? There was always something slightly. That was Helena's sharpest instrument. It did the most damage with the least evidence. Slightly unstable. Slightly inappropriate. Slightly unsuited to the demands of her position. 5 conversations. 2 weeks. 5 different drawing rooms. And Eleanor understood a story was being built. About her. Without her. With great skill and no fingerprints, and the particular violence of a smile deployed as a blade. She was being erased. Not dramatically. Not in any way that could be pointed to and named. With concern. With the perfectly maintained fingernails of a woman who had been wielding social power for 40 years and had developed over those 40 years a near-surgical precision in its application. Eleanor went home after the 5th overheard conversation and sat for a long time in Frederick's study. She did not panic. She thought. She thought about the account books she had tried in the last 6 months of his life to understand. The ones that did not quite add up in a way she could not precisely locate. She thought about the locked drawer in Frederick's desk. The key she had not found. She thought about the expression on Thomas Brandt's face, the one time she had casually asked to see the Brunwald estate records. Not alarm. Something slightly too smooth. There was that word again. Slightly. She opened Frederick's desk. Began again to look for the key. Did not find it. Not yet. But she understood now with a certainty that had not been there before that there was something in that drawer worth the lock. And she intended to find it. Helena made the proposal on a Tuesday. The sitting room of the Voss residence on the Volzila smelled of gardenias and old certainty. Helena poured tea with the careful precision of a woman who understands that every gesture is a statement. The cups were Meissen. The tablecloth was Belgian lace. The expression of concern on Helena's face was also imported. "My dearest Eleanor," she began, which was already wrong, because Eleanor was not her dearest anything. Eleanor picked up her tea. She looked at the cup. Meissen, blue onion pattern, the kind of object that signals its own importance. She thought about the locked drawer. She thought about the account books. She thought, "You are sending me away because I am close to something you cannot afford me to find. You have decided I am easier to manage at 3 days' carriage distance than in the same city where I might eventually open the right drawer or speak to the right lawyer. You are wrapping this in concern because you have spent 60 years converting your intentions into music, and you expect me to hear only the melody." But Eleanor had been listening for what was underneath things her entire life. It was in the end the only skill her circumstances had reliably developed. She set the cup down. "I appreciate your thinking of me," she said. And then she said yes. She left Vienna on December 5th, 1863. 2 trunks, a crate of books, the kinds that do not comfort but teach. Agricultural theory, property law, basic accountancy, the sort of reading that announces to anyone who sees it, "This woman intends to understand something," and a leather travel case that had belonged to Frederick, which she packed last. Found tucked into its satin lining a small handkerchief, dark blue silk, his initials monogrammed in the corner. And inside the handkerchief, as if placed there for safekeeping, and then forgotten in the particular way that things get forgotten when a person runs out of time, a small brass key. She looked at it for a moment. She packed it. She climbed into the carriage. She did not look back at Vienna as they pulled away, not because she was above sentiment, because she was already thinking forward. 3 days, 55 years old, balding, competent in the way of men who have spent long careers in administrative positions, reliable on surfaces, protective of depths. He smiled when she stepped from the carriage. The smile of someone who has prepared one. "Lady Ashbourne, welcome to Brunwald." She looked at the house, then at him. "What state are the accounts in?" A pause. "Fractional. The kind most people would not notice." Eleanor noticed everything. "Perhaps after you've had time to settle." "The accounts," she said again. Not louder, just more precisely. The accounts were a disaster. She spent the first evening at the dining table with 3 oil lamps and 6 years of records, and worked through them until 2 in the morning while Thomas hovered, and she sent him to bed. Debt to 4 suppliers. 3 years accumulated in some cases. Salaries owed to workers who had Thomas mentioned this with the weather event tone of someone reporting a thing that happened rather than a thing anyone caused, largely left. Contracts renegotiated 2 years ago at terms so unfavorable they required either extraordinary incompetence or something else entirely to explain. The eastern fields, which the older records suggested should be among the most productive on the property, had yielded almost nothing for 6 years because the drainage was wrong, and had apparently been wrong for 6 years without anyone determining this was worth fixing. She went through every page. Thomas hovered. She sent him to bed. She stayed until 2. And then she thought, looking at the numbers in the lamplight. Helena managed the central accounts. These field revenues were reported upward to Helena. And these numbers did not match anything a reasonably managed estate should produce. She filed the thought. Not yet. Not yet. She went to sleep. Got up at 5:30 because there was no version of fixing this that involved sleeping later than 5:30. The first winter was the hardest thing Eleanor Ashbourne had done. Not the cold, though the cold was serious. 3 wood-burning stoves for a house that had been built to require 7. Mornings where the water in the washing basin had a skin of ice. She broke with her knuckle before she could wash her face. Drafts that moved through the East Corridor with the confidence of permanent residents. Not the work, though. The work was unending. It was the sensation of moving in a language she did not yet speak. Vienna had equipped her for a specific kind of life. French. Deportment. The management of social situations where the rules were legible and the consequences were social and the resources were, if not plentiful, at least predictable. Brunwald offered mud. Crop yield terminology she had never encountered. The particular expression on Georg the head farmhand's face when the new mistress from Vienna appeared in the frozen field at 6 in the morning in boots that were quietly and obviously completely wrong. She noticed that expression, filed it, bought different boots, and she cried. She will say this plainly because it was true, and because it was not weakness, and because the crying was necessary in the way that drainage is necessary. At night, door locked, candle out. In the absolute dark of a Styrian countryside house, where there is no ambient light whatsoever, and you are entirely alone with everything you have not yet examined, she cried for the marriage that had been a transaction dressed as a life. She cried for the children she had wanted and not had. She cried for Frederick, not the man he was exactly, but the gap between what they had been to each other and what might have existed if more things had been different. She cried for Vienna, which had not been good to her but had been known. And there is a specific grief in losing what was familiar, even when it was never kind. She cried for herself, which was perhaps the hardest thing to allow, and also the most necessary. She cried. Then she stopped. Then she started asking questions. The question that changed everything was about barley. Specifically, why was the northern slope planted with barley when every soil indicator she had read about in the agricultural text she had brought from Vienna suggested rye would perform significantly better in those exact drainage conditions? She asked Thomas first. Thomas said something about tradition. Tradition, which is what people say when they mean I do not know. And I would prefer you stop asking. She asked Georg. Georg started to give her a short answer because short answers were what Georg had been trained to expect was appropriate. But Eleanor asked a follow-up question that indicated she had been listening, not performing the listening, actually doing it. And Georg recalibrated slightly and gave her a longer answer, and then mentioned at the end, almost as an afterthought, that if she really wanted to understand what Brunwald's land was capable of, she should probably talk to Marta. Marta said Eleanor. Marta Heil said Georg. Delivers eggs twice a week. Knows every inch of this valley. Her father worked this estate for 22 years. Marta Heil arrived on a Wednesday morning with 16 eggs and absolutely no interest in impressing anyone. 43 years old. Compact in the manner of someone who has done outdoor physical work for decades. Not elegant, but nothing wasted. The kind of face that shows both weather and thought, which is rarer than it sounds. She set the eggs on the kitchen table, looked at Eleanor the way she looked at everything, directly. "You're the new one from Vienna." "I am," said Eleanor. "You've sorted the boot situation. The previous pair is on the porch. They won't improve with weather exposure." A pause, not awkward, efficient. "Was there something you wanted to ask, or are we going to talk around it for a while?" Eleanor stopped and felt for the first time since arriving in Brunwald something that might eventually become amusement. "The northern slope," she said. "Barley or rye?" Marta looked at her, then sat down. Without being invited, which was also not Vienna. And she talked for 11 minutes about the drainage characteristics of that particular hillside, about water table behavior in March, about root depth requirements of barley versus rye, about the decision made at some point by someone who had clearly never walked that hillside in early spring, when you can feel the water table pushing up through the soles of your boots to plant barley which continued to be made every year after that, by people who trusted the decision of the person who had made the first decision, which is how agricultural mistakes compound themselves over generations. Eleanor took notes. Marta watched her take notes. And something passed between them in that kitchen. Not friendship. Something that precedes it. Something closer to the specific recognition of one person who has spent their life being spoken at, rather than spoken to, recognizing the same experience in another. Marta looked at the notebook. "You're actually writing it down. Did you think I wouldn't? Most people from Vienna ask questions and then do what they were going to do anyway." A pause. "It's a kind of theater." "I'm not from Vienna in any way that matters," said Eleanor. "I just lived there." Marta considered this for a moment, picked up her empty egg basket. "I know a man in the next valley who does drainage work," she said. "Good work. When you're ready for the East Field." "I'd like his name," said Eleanor. "Give it a few weeks," said Marta. "See if you're still here." She was still there. February map of the problems. March priorities established. Most urgent debts cleared. A payment schedule for the rest that the suppliers accepted because Eleanor had made it clear in the negotiations that she understood exactly what the contract terms said and would continue understanding them going forward. Which was in business as in social situations sufficient to change the temperature of a room. The workers who had left too came back, not because of sentiment, because Marta had not as advocacy, but as fact-stating mentioned to certain people that things at Brunwald were different now. The word she used apparently was different. Not better yet, just different. Worth seeing. In the granary barn on Saturday mornings, Eleanor began teaching the farmhands' children reading and arithmetic. 6 children the first week, then 9, then 14. She did not make speeches about the importance of education. She simply appeared at the barn on Saturday with chalk and a board, and the assumption that the children would find it interesting. They did. Marta began sitting in on Saturdays, not as a student, as someone who mentioned once that she liked the way Eleanor taught, specifically without assuming the children already knew they were worth teaching. "My father used to say," Marta said one morning as they walked the East Field in early spring, "the worst kind of ignorance is the kind a person has been taught to expect from themselves." Eleanor stopped walking, wrote it in the notebook. started walking again. Something was building between them that neither of them named because they were both practical women who understood that naming a thing too early can make it fragile. But it was there. In the field checks, in the Saturday barn sessions, in the way Marta increasingly said what she thought, without the 5-second delay of calculating how it would be received. Eleanor had not had this before. Not in Vienna. Not in her marriage. Not anywhere. Someone who spoke to her as if the truth of a thing was the only relevant consideration. She found she needed it more than she had known. The key was still in her pocket in April when the thaw came, and the mud arrived with the specific determination of something that has been patient all winter. She chose a Tuesday. Thomas was in the village on an errand. A genuine errand. She had manufactured genuine errands for him regularly now, each one designed to have a duration she could predict. A practical habit she had developed without fully examining why. Or rather, without allowing herself to examine why yet. Because some observations needed more time to become conclusions. She went to Frederick's old study, took the key from her pocket, sat in front of the locked drawer for one long moment, thinking it might be nothing, knowing it is not nothing. Opened it. Inside a single letter. Frederick's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, the careful, slightly cramped cursive of a man who had been taught to write beautifully and had maintained the discipline in specific moods and let it deteriorate in others. Addressed to Herr Wilhelm Lenz, Advocate, Herrengasse, Prague. Dated the 17th of June, 1863. Frederick had died on the 20th, 3 days before this letter was sent. She read it. Twice, then a third time. The letter broke off mid-sentence, as if he had been interrupted, or had simply reached the moment when he could no longer hold the pen steady enough to continue. But what was there was enough. Frederick had been tracking irregularities in the Ashbourne accounts for 8 months. He named them. Specific. Dated. Documented. The names of accounts through which money had passed. The management firms that appeared on the surface to be independent financial entities and were on closer examination connected through layers of administrative structure to Helena Voss's personal financial management. He estimated the total across 12 years, and he named a number. Eleanor's hands did not move. She read the number again. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she kept reading. Frederick had also written about the doctor. Dr. Brower, recommended by Helena. The medicines he had been prescribed seemed to Frederick's non-medical understanding inconsistent with what he had read about his condition. He had been intending to seek a second medical opinion. He had not. He wanted to alarm anyone prematurely. He was being careful. He was gathering information first. The sentence stopped there. He never finished it. Eleanor sat very still, not frightened. She checked for fear the way you check a room when you enter it in the dark methodically by feel. And it was not there. What was there instead was something else. A sensation she had to name carefully, because she had not felt it before in quite this form. Clarity. The specific, almost painful clarity of someone who has been working in a room with insufficient light for months, and someone has just opened the curtains all at once. And the room turns out to be exactly the room she suspected, but bigger and colder and considerably more significant. She folded the letter, placed it back in the drawer, locked it, put the key in her pocket, went to dinner, asked Thomas over soup about the barn roof repair schedule, said nothing else, because this was not the moment for action. This was the moment for understanding the full dimensions of what she had found. You do not run toward an enormous thing. You walk carefully. You make sure the ground will hold your weight before you step. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, while Thomas was in the village on a 2-hour errand, she went to the cellar. Thomas had mentioned during the first week's orientation that the old storage below was disorganized, probably not worth the time. That sentence had gone into the back of Eleanor's notebook, where she kept the observations that did not have names yet. But that had a quality about them, a specific texture, that told her they would eventually become something important. Probably not worth the time was a judgment, made by someone else, about Eleanor's time, which was precisely the kind of presumption she had been developing over the course of the preceding months, a professional and unhurried skepticism toward. The cellar was cold and dark and smelled of damp stone and old paper, boxes, broken furniture, the accumulated non-decisions of a house where people had lived for a long time without ever quite facing the question of what to keep. She worked methodically from front to back, behind a collapsed shelving unit, the kind of collapse that can happen naturally over time or can be encouraged to look that way. She found them. 12 ledgers, brown cloth covers worn at the corners with the specific wearing that only years produce. She lifted the first one carefully, opened it, and read in handwriting that was even and careful, and entirely confident in its own importance, property of J. Hiles Stewart, Brunwald Estate from the year of our Lord 1847. She sat down on a crate. In the dark, in the cold. Hile, Marta's father. She opened the first ledger, then the second, then the third. She carried them upstairs 2 at a time. Johann Heil had been a man who believed that facts were sacred. Every page of every ledger said so. Revenue by field, by season, by crop type. Expenditure itemized into labor materials, maintenance, transport. Year-over-year comparisons. Margin notes about anomalies, a flood year, a blight, a harvest that overperformed, and why. The record-keeping of someone who understood that information is not merely useful. It is entrusted. It has weight. It must be handled accordingly. 22 years. Eleanor went through them over 3 nights. Cross-referenced against the official Ashbourne accounts as reported to Vienna, against what she had found when she arrived in December, with 3 oil lamps and 6 years of records that did not add up to anything honest. She checked 3 times, because certainty of this kind required triple confirmation. What the Heil ledgers showed was this. Brunwald had been reliably, solidly, consistently productive for 15 years. Not spectacular, but real. The performance of an estate where someone was paying honest attention and the land was responding accordingly. That revenue had been reported to the Ashbourne Central Accounts, managed by Helena Voss, at figures substantially below what Johann Heil had actually recorded. Not rounding variance, not administrative difference. A pattern, deliberate, sustained. running quietly for over a decade through the accounting structures of an estate whose widow was now sitting at the dining table with 5 oil lamps burning past midnight. Looking at 12 ledgers that proved it, Eleanor put the last ledger down. The house was completely silent. The Styrian winter dark pressed against every window. And she thought Helena sent me here. Helena chose Brunwald. Helena arranged this exile. And Helena, who had managed these accounts for 12 years, who had everything to lose from Eleanor staying in Vienna and asking questions about financial irregularities, had sent her to the one place in the world that contained 15 years of evidence in the handwriting of a meticulous, faithful, long-dead steward who had apparently believed with every entry he made that the truth written down cannot be buried, that it can only wait. The irony was almost elegant, almost funny. The kind of mistake a very careful person makes when they are so accustomed to being the smartest mind in every room that they forget to account for the rooms they have never entered. Eleanor did not laugh, but something settled in her chest. Something that was not anger and was not triumph and was not relief. Something quieter than all of those. The specific, grounded certainty of someone who is just found in a cellar behind a collapsed shelf. The answer to a question she had not fully known how to ask until this moment. She carried the ledgers to the office, locked them with Frederick's letter. 2 pieces of the same truth kept together. Then she went to bed and slept for the first time since December, until morning light. She told Marta the next day. Not everything. Not yet. But she said while they were walking the northwest corner of the east field, where Marta had been pointing out the specific drainage problem in the subsoil, that she had found some old records of Johann's in the cellar. Marta stopped walking. His ledgers, she said. Not a question. Yes. A long moment passed between them. The field around them was still winter gray. The sky was the color of old wool. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line. He kept everything Marta said finally. Every number. Every note. Her voice had the particular quality of someone speaking about a person they loved without sentimentality. Just fact. He used to say, the truth written down cannot be buried. It can only wait. She looked at the field. He believed that the way other people believe in God. That honesty, documented properly, outlasts everything else. Eleanor looked at the field, too. He was right, she said, and she said it with a weight that Marta, who was not a woman who missed things, clearly heard. Marta looked at her sideways, said nothing. Then, the northwest corner needs a channel before spring planting. The man in the next valley, his name is Haas. He does good work. Want his contact? Yes, said Eleanor. They walked on. The ground soft and cold under their boots. And between them, in the space between what had been said and what had not been said, something had taken shape, not yet named, but real. The way most real things begin. Not with an announcement, with 2 people walking in the same direction, in the same mud, with the same understanding of what the ground beneath them requires. That spring, Eleanor drafted the first outline of a drainage proposal for the East Field. The Saturday barn school had 18 children now. She filed new observations about Thomas Brandt in the back of the locked notebook. Still unnamed. Still accumulating. The way clouds accumulate before weather, not dramatically, just steadily until the sky is a different sky than the one you were standing under this morning. She did not open the locked drawer again. She did not move the ledgers. She did not write to the lawyer in Prague, because she understood something now that she had not understood fully when she arrived. That what she was building in this valley, in this house, in this carefully maintained silence, needed to be built until it could not be dismantled. A case so complete, so cross-referenced, so sourced from records she had not created, and could not be accused of having manufactured, that no one in any imperial court would have room to question it. And that takes time. She knew this the way she knew the East Field, by walking it, by pressing her heel into the ground and feeling what the soil required, by understanding that you do not rush things that need to hold weight. You build them carefully, one true thing at a time. Here is what nobody tells you about starting over. It is not one moment. It is not a morning you wake up and decide. It is not a letter you write, or a door you close, or a single clean break that you can point to later and say there. That was when. It is Tuesday, then Wednesday, then a Thursday in March, when the mud is so deep that your boots make a sound pulling free from it that is embarrassing and also somehow deeply satisfying, like the earth itself is participating, like it is releasing something it has been holding. And you think, well, another day done. And then you do Friday. That was how Eleanor Ashbourne rebuilt Brunwald. Not dramatically. Not in a montage of competence that a person could admire from a distance. 1 acre at a time. 1 contract at a time. 1 Saturday morning in a granary barn with 6 children and a piece of chalk. And the understanding, not hope, not optimism, but settled understanding that this was worth doing. Because it was. Simply that. Worth doing. By spring of 1864, the most urgent debts were gone. By summer, the Eastfield drainage project had begun. Hass from the next valley turned out to be everything Marta had indicated, which was that he did good work and charged honestly, and would not pretend a simpler solution would do, when the actual solution was more expensive. Eleanor appreciated people who would not pretend. She had encountered too few of them. She studied the drainage plans with him every Thursday, asked questions that he initially answered with the particular patience of a craftsman explaining to a client. Then, by the 4th week, answered with something different. The slightly adjusted posture of a man who has realized the person across from him is not asking client questions, is asking engineer questions, is asking questions that indicate she has read the relevant literature and thought about it, and is now probing for the specific gap between what the literature describes and what the actual ground requires, which was not what he expected from anyone, let alone. He did not say that part. He was a tactful man, but Eleanor could read rooms. She could certainly read fields. The Saturday barn school had 18 children by midsummer, then 23. The problem with teaching children to read, Eleanor discovered, is that they tell other children. Who tell their parents? Who mention it to the next farm over? And suddenly you have a waiting list for a barn school in Styria, and you need a second board, and more chalk, and a system. She made a system. Marta started staying for the full session, not because she had nothing else to do, Because she said once watching Eleanor correct a 9-year-old girl's arithmetic with a precision that managed to be both exact and kind that she had never seen a person so certain that a child's attention was worth treating seriously. Most people, Marta said, teach children the way they handle stray cats, with one hand. Eleanor looked up from the board. What does that mean? Means you're always ready to withdraw the other one, in case they scratch, or run, or need more than you plan to give. Marta looked at Rosa, the 9-year-old who was now correcting her own arithmetic with focused intensity. You don't do that. Eleanor looked at Rosa too. She's going to be better at numbers than I am in 4 years, she said. 5, I think, said Marta. She's stubborn. I said better. Not faster. Marta smiled, which for Marta was the equivalent of another person laughing. The notebooks grew, not just accounting. Eleanor had begun by the 2nd year a methodology she could not have named properly, because she had invented it out of necessity and had no frame of reference for whether it was ordinary or not. Soil observation records, weather patterns mapped against yield variations, planting decisions documented with the reasoning behind each one, so that a year later she could return to the page and see whether the reasoning had held, and if it had not, understand why. Every decision she made, with the working behind it. Because the only way she knew to teach herself was to write down what she was thinking while she thought it, and then check it against reality and then adjust. It was the agricultural equivalent of auditing yourself, which, given how she had arrived at Brunwald, seemed appropriate. By the 3rd year, she had 4 thick notebooks filled. By summer of 1866, she had 6. The system had become, without her intending this, a comprehensive record of how to manage this specific valley's specific land in its specific climate through its specific variations, not theory. Observe practice, documented, sourced, correctable. Thomas Brandt, who managed the day-to-day operations she delegated, was efficient and cooperative and had a quality she had been watching for almost 2 years now without fully naming. He was too smooth in certain moments. The moments when she mentioned things she had not discussed with anyone else, and then the same things approximate, filtered through one layer of simplification, appeared in patterns of behavior or decision she could not account for. Small things. A supplier who renegotiated terms in a way that suggested he had advance information about her negotiating position. A buyer who showed up 2 weeks earlier than she had announced he would, as if someone had given him a different timeline. Individual instances explainable. Pattern of instances something else. She filed the observations. 3rd section of the notebook. Locked. Not yet. Not until she could see the full shape. Casimir Aldrin arrived on a Tuesday morning in September of 1866. She heard the horse before she saw it. She was on the east field with Haas, reviewing the final phase of the drainage channel. A secondary branch whose angle she believed had been miscalculated by 3 degrees, which Haas was maintaining with professional dignity was more like 2. This was a conversation they had been having productively for 10 minutes. The horse came up the main road. She did not look up. She finished the conversation, made the note, handed Haas back his survey paper. Then she turned. He had already dismounted, which was the first thing she noticed. Most men of ministerial rank, and she could see from across the courtyard that this was what he was. It was in the coat and the posture and the particular quality of stillness stayed on their horses until someone came to them. As a declaration of relative status, as the micro-architecture of hierarchy. He had just gotten down, 40 years old, broad-shouldered in a charcoal wool travel coat that had been worn on actual journeys and had the honest wear to prove it. The posture was military, not the performance of military bearing the bone-deep product of someone trained young, and then tempered by something that had nothing to do with parade grounds. A slight asymmetry in his stride across the courtyard, a leftward compensation he had clearly worked to minimize, did not quite work on uneven terrain. Dark hair, silver already committed at the temples not dabbling, gray-green eyes that moved across the field the way her eyes moved across account books, assessing actual content, not decorative surface. He found her among the workers, came directly. Lady Ashbourne. The voice was low, economic. No flourishes. Casimir Aldrin, Ministry of Imperial Properties. I've been designated for the routine inspection of this estate. Eleanor looked at him, then looked back at her notebook, wrote a final notation and closed it. The inspection was due 3 years ago, she said. A pause, not defensive. Recalibrating. Correct, he said. I can explain the delay after midday. She picked up her survey sheet. You're welcome to wait at the house or observe the work here. Another pause, slightly longer. I'll observe, he said, if that's no inconvenience. And he stayed, which was the second surprise, and did not offer opinions, did not correct anyone, did not perform the role of inspector watching the workers in the way that role usually gets performed with a slightly elevated chin and the energy of a man waiting for an error to point to. He watched the way she watched things, for information. The inspection was supposed to take 2 days. It took a week. Not because the records were complicated. They were by this point among the most organized accounts she could imagine. She had been auditing herself for 2 years. She knew exactly where every number came from and exactly where it went, and exactly what the 3 independent sources were that confirmed each figure. A trained auditor could have cleared the official inspection in an afternoon. But Casimir Aldrin was not asking auditor questions. He asked why the north slope was planted with rye. She explained. He asked which variable she had weighted most heavily in that decision. She explained further. He asked what she had considered and rejected. She went further still into the 2-year observation record and the specific March behavior of that slope's subsoil, and the conversation with Marta that had initiated her thinking on the matter. He followed all of it, not nodding, not waiting for his turn, actually following, asking the next question in a sequence that was only possible if the preceding answer had been genuinely processed, which was unusual. Eleanor found herself against the internal resistance she maintained the way other people maintain fences, explaining more than she had planned, going longer than was required, and then noticing she had done this and recalibrating and pulling back to professional brevity. And then he would ask another question, and she would go long again. It was deeply inconvenient. On the 4th day, The rain came. Low Styrian autumn rain. Not dramatic, just serious. The kind that settles in for the afternoon with the attitude of something that has been invited. Eleanor was in the study. Thomas had gone to the mill. And Casimir Aldrin, through the serving woman, sent a message he had found the library and would it be acceptable to spend the afternoon there. She said yes, without considering it carefully, because the accounts were more pressing, and a man quietly reading in the library was the least inconvenient version of a man she had encountered. 2 hours later, she passed the half-open door. He was standing by the tall window with the afternoon light coming in sideways and gray. One of her agricultural volumes in both hands. Open near the back where the margins were, she did not need to see which section to know which section. She had been annotating the drainage chapter for over a year. He was reading the margins. His face had an expression she had to look at for a moment to categorize. Not surprise. Something that comes before surprise. Something like the expression of someone walking a path they know and encountering terrain that is different from what the map describes. Not wrong. Different. More. He looked up when she came in, then lifted the book slightly. Just the book. Just that small movement. These annotations, he said, are they yours? Not quite a question. He already knew. Yes, she said, and she waited. Because this was the moment that always came. The moment when a man of a certain position encountered something a woman had produced that he had not anticipated encountering. And he had to decide in the half-second that decision actually happens, what to do with the distance between his expectation and the reality. Some men rounded up. How unexpected for a woman in your situation, which contained within it a compliment and an insult so tightly wound together, you could not extract one without unraveling the other. Some men rounded down, ignored what they had seen, asked something else, moved on, as if the mismatch between expectation and evidence were a social irregularity best overlooked. Casimir Aldrin did neither. He looked at the open page for a moment longer. Then he said, "You should have published this. 5 words, no ceremony, no performance, no visible awareness that he was saying something she might need to hear, or that he might be doing something generous. Just the statement of a fact as he saw it. You should have published this." Eleanor turned her face slightly. Not to hide tears, she was not gonna cry. She was 33 years old and had made extensive practice of not crying in front of people who had not earned it. But because the armor had taken a hit in a place she had not armored properly, 5 words without intent to wound are sometimes more accurate than 500 aimed deliberately, because they go where the gaps are. She turned back. The Ministry of Imperial Properties, she said, does not generally publish agricultural treatises written by inconvenient widows. It came out with the weight of 3 years of Brunwald and the 3 years before that in Vienna, and the 28 years before that of being too tall and too direct and too much in ways that required constant management. He looked at her. "It hasn't," he said. "Things can change." Not things will change. Not a promise. A possibility. Stated with the plainness of someone who had not arrived. Prepared to comfort her. Which was somehow more bearable than comfort would have been. She did not leave the library. They stayed until the serving woman knocked to announce dinner, and both of them looked up with the faintly startled expression of people who had been somewhere and are being returned to the room they are actually in. They had talked about the drainage treatise and the specific marginal disagreements she had developed with the author's chapter on Eastern Styrian soil behavior. They had talked in the sideways manner of two people discussing something without naming what they are actually discussing about the specific loneliness of working in a direction no one else can see yet. About the gap between knowing something and being able to transmit the knowing to anyone who might use it. About what it is like to be capable of a thing and to be somewhere that does not know how to use that capability or does not want to. Neither of them said exile. Neither of them said Helena. But the conversation had those shapes. Casimir left at the end of the week. He said the formal report would arrive within 6 weeks. He said the estate was in excellent order. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without ornament. Eleanor stood in the courtyard and watched him ride out. Then she went inside, sat at the desk, thought with the methodical honesty she applied to all things. Something is happening that I have not decided about yet. And then I need more information before I decide anything. And then the accounts need updating before end of month. She opened the account books. She was very good at redirecting herself. She had been practicing it for a long time. The letters started within a month, formally. The way these things begin. Clarifications required for the ministerial report. Requests for 3 years of yield comparison data in a specific format. The kind of correspondence with a legitimate purpose that stays inside its legitimate purpose. Except the third letter included at the end, after the formal close, a paragraph about a book he had been reading. An agricultural history of the Rhine Valley water management systems 18th century, that he thought she might find the irrigation chapters of particular interest given the Brunwald East Field project. Eleanor read that paragraph twice, then wrote a response about the formal data he had requested. At the end, after the formal close, she wrote a paragraph about the Rhine Valley book and what she had actually found more interesting, which was the appendix which most people apparently did not read, and which contained the case study that undermined the entire central argument of Chapter 6. His response arrived in 12 days. He had read the appendix, of course he had, and had a different interpretation of the case study, which he articulated clearly, without the elaborate hedging that people use when they are uncertain whether the person they are writing to can handle a direct disagreement. She wrote back, disagreed with his interpretation, explained why. He disagreed with her disagreement. She disagreed with that. This went on for 3 more exchanges, until they reached what was essentially the same conclusion from opposite directions, which they both acknowledged in the same letter, his arriving the same day as hers, which required a moment of standing in the hall, holding 2 letters and feeling for the first time, in a long time, something uncomplicated, something like amusement. She put both letters in the locked drawer, on top of Frederick's letter, and the observations about Thomas, and did not examine why she was keeping them there. It was Marta who named the thing Eleanor had been watching without naming. They were in the barn one October evening after the Saturday school stacking chalk and rearranging benches. The children had gone. It was nearly dark outside. The barn had the particular warmth of a space that has been occupied recently by many small bodies. My father said Marta, not out of nowhere, out of the middle of a thought she had been having while they stacked benches. He kept those ledgers because he believed something. Eleanor set down a bench. Believed what? Marta picked up the chalk box. That a thing written down honestly cannot be destroyed. It can be hidden, can be locked in a cellar under a collapsed shelf, can be there for 17 years, with no one looking at it. She put the box on the shelf. But it does not stop being true. It waits, patient as rock. The barn was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the tree line. When he wrote those ledgers, every entry he used to say, "I am writing this for the day when someone needs to know." He did not know who. He did not know when. She looked at the shelf where the chalk box sat. He just trusted the truth to find its moment. Eleanor had been looking at the floor. She looked up now, and in Marta's face, which was not a dramatic face, not an expressive face in the usual way, but a face she had learned to read over almost 3 years of walking this valley together, she saw something. Not grief. Something older than grief. The clear-eyed love of someone who has sorted through a loss and kept what was real and released what was not. "He was right," said Eleanor, quietly. "He was usually right," said Marta. "About the land, about numbers, about people mostly." A pause. "He was wrong about my brother, but that's a story for another evening." Eleanor almost laughed. Marta looked at her sideways. The inspector. What about him? He asked good questions. He did. Marta picked up a broom, began sweeping. The kind of questions someone asks when they're not trying to find what they expected to find. "No," said Eleanor. "The kind they ask when they're trying to find what's actually there." "Yes," said Eleanor. Marta swept. Eleanor straightened the remaining benches. "I've had very few people in my life," Eleanor said. "Who did that?" And then she stopped, because that was already more than she had planned to say, and she could feel the next sentence in her chest, and was not certain she was prepared to let it out. Marta swept, did not look at her. "Yes," said Marta simply. "That's the thing about people who actually look. They're rarer than they should be. And when you find one, it's..." She paused, considered, resumed sweeping. "Interesting." Interesting. Eleanor stood in the warm barn in the October dark and thought, yes, that is perhaps the safest word for it. Interesting. 3 months after Casimir's inspection, Eleanor was walking the northwest fence line with Marta on a cold, clear morning when Marta mentioned a court case. Not dramatically, not as a subject, as a sentence that arrived in the middle of something else. She had been talking about her father, about a time years ago when Johann Heil had testified as a witness in a legal proceeding. Something involving property accounts, something in the regional courts. "He said the judge was fair," said Marta, which was not something you could say about all of them. "The judge ruled against a countess from Vienna, something about the way she'd structured a financial arrangement with an estate in the lower valley. My father said the ruling was right, that the numbers did not lie." Eleanor kept walking. What happened to the judge, she said, conversationally, carefully, reassigned within the year. His entire caseload reviewed. Career essentially gone in 18 months. Marta looked at the fence. My father said he never understood it. The man had done everything correctly. What was the judge's name? Mercer, I think. Regional Court. I was about 12. So she did the arithmetic. Mercer. Casimir Aldrin. Aldrin. She kept her face forward. Not the same name. Different name. Could be nothing. But the pattern of it. A judge who ruled against Helena's financial structure and lost his career in 18 months. And a man from the ministry who had specifically ensured he was assigned to an estate whose administration bore the same structural fingerprints as whatever that judge had seen. The same fingerprints. She needed to confirm, but she needed to confirm carefully. Casimir came back in December. The supplementary visit that both of them understood was not supplementary, that both of them were performing some formality about without discussing the performance. He arrived on a Thursday. She had managed through errand manufacture, of which she was becoming quietly expert, to have Thomas away for 2 days. On the second evening after dinner, she said, "There's a regional court ruling I was looking into, 18 years ago. Property trust management. Something about a financial arrangement being structured specifically to obscure the origin of funds." He was still. Which case, he said. She gave the year, the lower court, the basic subject. He said nothing. She watched his face. The thing that happened there was not emotion in the usual surface sense. It was something deeper. A recalibration at the level of the architecture. A man who has kept something very controlled for a very long time and is suddenly in a room where the structure he controls it within is no longer quite the right shape. My father, he said, made that ruling. She had expected this. Knowing something is coming does not always diminish it. He lost his position. Within 10 months, said Casimir. His case reviews were reopened. Most of his significant rulings were reversed. He retired within 2 years. He believed until he died that the ruling had been correct. A pause. He believed it was arranged. It was arranged, said Eleanor quietly. Casimir looked at her. You know by whom? I have suspected, she said, for 3 years. I have been building evidence for 2. I needed to confirm this piece. The fire had burned low between them. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something important has just been said, and neither person has yet moved. How long, said Casimir, have you been building this case? Since I found what was locked in a cellar under a collapsed shelf, she said. 17 years of a dead man's faithful record-keeping. He sat with that for a moment. Then you have the Heil ledgers. I have Frederick's letter, too. He was going to the same lawyer you'd have told me to find. You need the current accounts, said Casimir. The Ashbourne Central Trust. The ones you can't access without ministerial authority. Yes. That requires a formal audit. Yes. Which I can initiate. Which will... Tell her something is moving, said Eleanor. Yes. But by the time she responds, you'll be ready. I need to be ready first." He looked at her, and she looked at him. And in that look was something that had been building through formal letters and supplementary visits, and an afternoon in a library with the rain coming down. Something she had been with considerable effort keeping in the third section of the locked notebook. Unnamed. Filed for later. Legitimate channels only, she said. Everything I bring has to be irrefutable. If anything becomes about method instead of evidence, he said. I understand. He did understand. That was the thing. He understood not just the words, but the shape of the reasoning under the words, because he had been sitting across from that same gap between knowing something and being able to prove it in a room where the proof would stick for 18 years. I'll initiate the audit through proper channels, he said. It will take 6 to 8 weeks to process. That gives me time. For what? To finish understanding Thomas Brandt, she said. Casimir was still. Thomas Brandt, he said, carefully. Yes. What about Thomas Brandt? Eleanor opened the bottom drawer of the office desk, took out the locked notebook, unlocked it, placed it in front of him open to the third section. He read. She watched him read. It took 4 minutes. He was a thorough reader. She had observed this. When he finished, he looked up. You've known since when he said. I have suspected since spring of '65. I've been certain since June of this year. That's 6 months. Yes. And you said nothing. I needed to understand the network first. If I moved on, Thomas, she would know the channel was burned and change her approach. I would lose the only clear view I had into her planning. Eleanor looked at the notebook. I also needed to confirm whether the channel extended further than Thomas. Whether there were others, and Thomas is the primary. There are 2 others at lower levels. I've mapped them. Casimir sat back, looked at her. You have been, he said, slowly writing Helena's intelligence reports for the past 6 months. I have been selecting what Thomas knows. Yes, everything she believes about the state of this investigation, I chose for her to believe. Yes. A long pause. What does she think she knows? Said Casimir. That I have recovered some estate records of limited financial significance. That I don't have a legal mechanism to act on them. That I have been mostly focused on the agricultural work and have not made the connection between the historical accounts and the current trust structure. A pause, and that I may be developing an inadvisable personal interest in a ministerial inspector. Very quiet. Casimir's expression did not change, but something underneath it did. The recalibration again, deeper this time. The last point, he said, was the most useful piece of information to control, said Eleanor. I see, said Casimir. She held his gaze. Is it true, he said. Not a question she had planned for, though she should have. She was the one who had put it on the table. She thought of the library and 5 words said without ceremony. She thought of an appendix that he had read. She thought of letters in the locked drawer that she was choosing not to examine too closely, because she could not afford the distraction yet. We can discuss that, she said, when the relevant work is done. He nodded. Once. Fair, he said. The counterattack arrived 4 weeks later, not with fanfare, not with anything that could be identified as an attack in the moment it happened. with the elegant indirection of someone who had been weaponizing social perception for 4 decades and could do it in her sleep. First signal a message to Casimir from Minister Stein, not asking about the audit, expressing delicately some institutional concern about the appearance of the inspector's extended involvement with a specific estate, suggesting that distance might be appropriate. For everyone's sake. For everyone's sake. Which means for your sake. Which means step back. Second signal a letter to a cousin of Marta's from an unidentified correspondent, asking with suspiciously specific interest about Lady Ashbourne's daily activities, her movements, her associations. Third signal a package arriving at the ministry, documents, an auditor's summary of what appeared to be systematic underreporting of Brunwald revenues, with Lady Ashbourne's name as the responsible party. Casimir came to Brunwald 4 days after the ministry package arrived, unannounced. Tuesday evening. Thomas was by design coincidence away. He sat down. Eleanor poured the evening tisane. He told her everything with the precision of a man who does not edit information when the recipient's decisions depend on its accuracy. The documents were forgeries. Eleanor knew this before he finished describing them, because she knew what the real records showed, because she had been maintaining those records with the specific intention that they be unimpeachable, because Helena had constructed the forgeries using the underreported figures as the baseline, not knowing that Eleanor had the Heil ledgers that established what the real baseline was. She does not know about the ledgers. Eleanor was still calm. The forgeries have a foundational error, she said. They use the reported revenue figures as ground truth. But I have 15 years of primary records that establish a different ground truth. Every figure they cite as evidence of underreporting is actually a figure Helena herself falsified in the central accounts. She set down the tisane cup. She is accusing me of doing the thing she did, with evidence she manufactured from the records she manipulated. Casimir looked at her for a moment. She's good, he said. She's very good, said Eleanor. And she does not know what I have, which is the only reason this is survivable. Yes. A pause. Stein told me to distance myself from this case, said Casimir. Eleanor nodded. I could lose my position, he said. I know, she said. The fire crackled. Outside, the first winter wind was starting, the sound of it in the eaves of the old stone house. I'm telling you anyway, said Casimir, and the word anyway sat in the room between them, because what that word contained what it cost from a man with a career worth protecting a man who had spent 18 years navigating institutional power carefully, because he understood what happened to people who did not, was not small. Anyway, which meant, despite, which meant, this is the thing I have decided matters more than the thing I am risking, which meant you should know that the calculation was made and the choice was deliberate. Eleanor looked at him. She thought of 5 words in a library. She thought of an appendix read. She thought of a drawer that was getting fuller. I need 6 more weeks, she said. For what? To complete the documentation. To have Wilhelm Lenz in Prague, the lawyer Frederick was writing to when he died, finish the financial trace. To prepare what I am going to bring to Vienna. You're going to the Emperor. The reports will reach him regardless. I would prefer to determine which ones he reads first. Casimir looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need?" he said. "The audit, officially. Through the ministry. Legitimate access to the central Ashbourne Trust accounts. That will move quickly once initiated. Helena will know immediately that." "By then," said Eleanor, "it won't matter. Because by then everything I am building will be complete. And what I bring to that room will not be possible to question." She said it without pride, without drama. Just fact. The statement of a woman who has been sitting in this valley for 3 years, building something that cannot be taken apart. Who knows this because she built it herself, piece by piece, in the mud and the cold and the silence of a place that was supposed to erase her. Casimir nodded. He initiated the audit the following week. Eleanor sat with Thomas Brandt the following Friday evening. The accounts were spread on the table as usual. She let the conversation run its ordinary course, drainage updates, the winter supply inventory, the contract renewal for the grain buyer in the city. Thomas was efficient and cooperative and completely unaware that across the table from him was a woman who had spent the past 6 months making very careful decisions about what he knew. At the end, while he was closing the account books, Eleanor said, "I found something interesting in the cellar last month. Some old documents. Probably not significant, but worth reviewing." Thomas paused at the account book. Just a pause. Very small. "What kind of documents?" he said. "I'm not entirely certain yet," said Eleanor. "I'm still going through them. Probably just old supply records. I can have a look if it would be helpful." "When I have a clearer picture," she said. "Thank you." He closed the account book. She watched his hands on the cover. She thought, "By the time you report that conversation, I will have already decided exactly how to use the response it generates." "Good night, Thomas," she said. "Good night, Lady Ashbourne," he said. He left. She opened the locked notebook to the 3rd section, wrote a date, a brief note about the conversation, closed it, locked it. Then she sat alone at the desk in the winter quiet of the house. 6 weeks, one more than she had planned. But the work would be done when it was done correctly, not before. She reached for the agricultural survey she had been reading that morning, opened it, got back to work. 7 weeks, one more than she had planned. That was how long it took to build something that could not be dismantled. Eleanor worked every night. Not the frantic working of the first Brunwald winter. Not the working against drowning, the working to stay afloat. This was different. This was the working of someone who knows exactly what she is making and why. Who has been gathering the materials for 3 years, without fully announcing even to herself that she was building toward this. The dossier had 6 sections. She will not catalog them here in the way of someone proud of the machinery, but the shape of it matters. Section 1. Brunwald's real numbers. Johann Heil's ledgers. 15 years. Every field. Every season. Cross-referenced, sourced, verified against 3 independent corroborating records that established the same baseline from different directions, because one source can be dismissed. 2 sources can be called coincidence. 3 sources become what they actually are. Facts. Section 2. The Ashbourne Central Trust accounts, obtained through Casimir's formal audit. 12 years of Helena Voss's management. Set beside the Heil ledgers. The gap between them rendered visible. not implied. Documented. The way a wound is documented, not for drama, for accuracy. Section 3. Wilhelm Lenz's financial trace. The Prague lawyer that Frederick had been writing to when he died had spent 2 months following the money through 4 layers of administrative structure, connecting what appeared to be independent management firms to what they actually were, connecting those to who had created them, and when, and in whose interest. Section 4. Frederick's letter, the original, authenticated by a handwriting specialist in Prague who had no connection to anyone involved, who had simply been asked, "Is this the handwriting of the man whose other documents I am providing for comparison?" and had said yes, unambiguously, yes. Section 5. Thomas Brandt. 6 months of letters, the originals, in Thomas's hand, dated, addressed. Traveling over 6 months from Brunwald to a post address in Vienna that corresponded when traced to a receiving office with one client. And beside each letter, Eleanor's notation in her smaller, precise hand. What Thomas had been given to report, what she had withheld, what she had adjusted. A 6-month record of managed intelligence. The timeline of a woman who had understood something and said nothing and used the silence productively. Section 6. The forgeries. Helena's counter-accusation documents, each one. Beside it, the original record it had been manufactured from. And in the margin in Eleanor's hand, a specific annotation. Not an argument, an error. The date that contradicted the account structure that did not exist until 2 years after the date it cited. The figure that had been taken from the falsified central accounts, rather than the real ledger baseline. The provenance that could not be established because the document it claimed to derive from had been modified before Eleanor arrived, and the modification was visible to anyone who looked at the original ink, which Eleanor had, for 3 years. The dossier had numbered pages, a full index, cross-references between sections that allowed any reader to follow any claim to its source, and from its source to its verification, without leaving the document. She had it bound in plain black cloth, no name on the cover, no ornament, no statement of its own importance, because it did not need any of those things. The truth documented properly does not need to announce itself. She spoke to Thomas Brandt on a Sunday evening in the 3rd week of December. The accounts were on the table as usual. She let the ordinary conversation run. Supply inventory, the miller's revised schedule, the winter fencing repair on the northeast corner. Thomas, as always, efficient, cooperative, completely inside the performance of a man who has nothing to hide. Eleanor had spent 2 years learning to maintain a performance of her own. She was by now very good at it. At the end of the evening, when he was closing the account books, she placed 3 letters on the table between them. His handwriting, his dates, his careful, professional reporting delivered over 6 months to a post address in Vienna. Thomas looked at the letters. He did not deny them. She had not expected him to. The kind of man who is competent enough to be useful to someone like Helena is competent enough to understand when the position is indefensible. The room was very still. How long, he said. Since June, she said. He absorbed this, ran the arithmetic. understood what 6 months of managed information meant. "You have a choice," said Eleanor. "You can leave Brunwald tonight, or you can come to Vienna in January and explain your actions directly to the Emperor." A pause. "You have the letters regardless," he said. "Yes." "Then why give me a choice?" She looked at him. Across 3 years of careful observation and careful silence, and the particular kind of patience that is not passivity but its precise opposite. "Because what you do next," she said, "is still yours." Thomas Brandt left that night. One bag, before midnight, without waking the house. Eleanor heard the door, lay still in the dark, listening to the sound of his footsteps across the frozen courtyard, and thought his leaving is its own testimony. A man with a clean conscience does not disappear before morning. She wrote the date in the notebook, filed it, went back to sleep. She went to the Saturday barn school the next morning. The children were in the middle of a discussion about fractions. A 9-year-old named Rosa had developed a theory about why dividing by 2 always resulted in a number that felt lonelier than the original. Eleanor had been looking forward to hearing where the theory was going. Rosa explained it with considerable mathematical creativity. Eleanor corrected the actual arithmetic and preserved the instinct behind the theory, because the instinct was not wrong. It was just ahead of the vocabulary. She thought, watching Rosa's face during the correction, "This is why I am doing all of it. Not only the ledgers, not only the truth. This too. This room. This child who believes numbers have emotional properties and who is, despite everything that is told her otherwise, completely correct, to believe that understanding things is available to her." After walking back to the house, she passed a woman she did not know, young, 25 perhaps, standing at the edge of the road in the particular frozen stillness of someone who has stopped because moving feels impossible. Well dressed in a way that indicated recent better circumstances. The specific quality of tension around the eyes and jaw that Eleanor recognized, because she had worn it herself. In the 3rd week after Frederick died, when the story was being built about her, and she could feel it being built and could not yet see how to stop it, Eleanor stopped. The woman looked up. "I'm sorry," the woman said. I'm waiting for someone." Quickly, the reflex of a person trained to take up as little space as possible. Eleanor looked at her, thought of Vienna, of salon corners, of a voice that always carried just far enough. "Whatever they're saying about you," said Eleanor. The woman blinked. "In whatever rooms you're not in," said Eleanor. "Whatever they've decided about you in your absence." She paused. "They're wrong. And you don't need to prove that to them." Another pause, shorter. "You only need to prove it to yourself." The woman stared at her. And Eleanor, who was already late and had an audit document to verify and a Prague lawyer to write, walked on. She did not know that woman's name. She did not know what had happened to her. She would never know what became of her. But she said it because it was true. Because someone should have said it to Eleanor Ashbourne 3 years ago. On a November Tuesday in Vienna, before the carriage and the 3-day road, and the crumbling roof and the exile that had turned out to be against all reasonable expectation, the making of her. Someone should have said it, and did not. So she said it to someone else, and went back to the audit document. She left for Vienna on the 15th of January, 1867, post train, not a private carriage, which was both practical and deliberate. The post train was faster, and Eleanor, who had spent 3 years rebuilding something from the ground up, had developed a permanent impatience with the decorative inefficiencies of private travel. She sat in the compartment with the dossier on her lap, covered in plain cloth, looking like nothing in particular, and watched the Styrian countryside give way to the wider Danube Valley, and then to the approaches of a city she had not seen in 3 years, Vienna. Same facades, same rhythm of carriage wheels on cobblestone coming up through the station walls. Same light on the winter stone, that particular Vienna light that makes everything look both grand and slightly cold. She had expected to feel something large, returning to the city that had erased her. Or tried to. What she felt instead was simpler. Focus. She had work to do. She was here to do it. The city was the city. She checked into the hotel near the Stadtpark, declined the social calls that appeared in embarrassing volume within 24 hours of her arrival becoming known. Because in Vienna, a widow returning from 3 years in the provinces after an imperial summons was a social event of significant entertainment value. She declined all of it. She reviewed the dossier for the last time. The morning of the audience, she dressed with the particular care of someone who understands that appearance is not vanity, but communication, and who has decided what she intends to communicate. The dress was wool, deep forest green, clean lines, no decoration that was not structural. A single brooch at the collar in dark stone. Her hair in the usual chignon, firm, exact, not a strand of performance in it. And her face, as it was, the birthmark along her right cheek from the outer eye to the edge of the jaw, the one that had been a source of whispered superstition in certain Viennese drawing rooms for 3 years before she left. The one that had been mentioned obliquely in Helena's careful salon campaign. That mark. Poor thing. Some say it brought bad fortune to the Duke. No powder, no strategic shadow, no veil, no engineering, just her face, in the light, as it had always been and as it would always be. The face of a woman who has run out of things to hide. Because she never had anything to hide. She picked up the dossier, walked out of the hotel. The Imperial Reception Hall was very large and very certain of its own importance. Marble floors that had been polished by people who worked before dawn. Ceiling details painted by someone who had died 100 years ago, and whose name most people in the room could not have told you. Crystal chandeliers throwing light at angles designed 2 centuries ago to make everyone in the room aware of hierarchy. Eleanor walked into it. The silence that fell was the kind that happens when a room receives something it was not prepared for. Not because she was dramatic. She was not dramatic. She was 34 years old and wearing forest green and carrying a plain black-bound document under one arm and walking with the specific quality of movement that comes from spending 3 winters and 3 springs and 3 summers walking Styrian fields in proper boots. not the movement of a woman presenting herself to a room, the movement of a woman who is going somewhere. And the room happens to be in the way. On the right side of the hall, in the position of an honored attendant, Countess Helena Voss, 65 years old, white hair with mathematical precision, silver blue silk, the cameo at her throat that Eleanor remembered from 100 Vienna occasions, the black eyes moving, assessing pricing, the expression of a woman watching a scene she has written and whose ending she knows. She looked at Eleanor for 2 seconds, then allowed a very small smile. There she is, the widow from Brunwald, exactly what I expected. On the left wall, in the formal stance of ministerial attendance, Casimir Aldrin. Eleanor did not look at him directly, but she registered contained, ready. A man who has done what he was going to do and is waiting without apology for whatever comes next. Emperor Karl IV, 41 years old. A man who had been trained since childhood to receive competing versions of the truth and to make decisions with incomplete information, which is all any emperor ever has. He observed Eleanor's entrance with evaluation, not performance, actual attention. She made the appropriate reverence, then rose. Your Majesty, clear, proportionate to the space, no anxiety, no performance. I was summoned to provide clarity regarding the Brunwald estate and the broader Ashbourne Trust management. I have brought what I believe will provide it. She handed the dossier to the attending court officer, who passed it to the emperor, who opened it and began to read. The first 10 minutes were almost quiet. The emperor read, passed sections to his 3 senior conseillers. The conseillers read. Their expressions moved in sequence from professional neutrality to something that required more internal management. When they reached section 5, the Thomas Brandt correspondence, one of the conseillers put the paper down and looked at the floor for a moment. Not because he was moved, because he was processing. Then Helena's advocate stepped forward. His name was not important. What was important was that he was 50, composed, expensive, and extremely good at the specific skill of appearing entirely reasonable while doing something else entirely. Your Majesty, he said, I have here documentation that comprehensively contradicts the claims being presented. Records demonstrating that it is in fact Lady Ashbourne who has been systematically underreporting the revenues of the Brunwald estate over the past 3 years, diverting the surplus to accounts under her personal control. He presented his documents with the confidence of someone who has prepared this carefully and knows his preparation is sound. Eleanor watched him present them. Let him finish. Let every paper be set before the court. Let the advocate return to his position with the settled certainty of a man who has played his card and watched it land. Then she opened the second satchel. Each document the advocate has presented, she said, has a corresponding original. She handed the second package to the court officer. Numbered to match, I would direct Your Majesty's attention to the margin annotations on each page, which identify the specific provenance error that distinguishes the forgery from the authentic record. She set the second satchel down and opened the third folder, which was the one that mattered. Additionally, she said, I am presenting the full correspondence between Thomas Brandt Brunwald's former estate manager and Countess Helena Voss, covering 6 months of regular communication. In Brandt's own handwriting, with my own notations dated and signed of which specific information I provided him during each period, and which I withheld. She placed the letters on the clerk's table. I would also note that Mr. Brandt was requested to attend today as a witness to the estate management dispute. He is currently in the back of the hall. There was a moment, a very particular kind of moment, the kind where everyone in a room understands simultaneously that the architecture of what they are inside has just changed. Thomas Brandt was in the back of the hall. He had been told through a formal ministerial summons that his presence was required as a witness to a property dispute. He had agreed to come because he had calculated in the weeks since leaving Brunwald that appearing cooperative was safer than appearing to have something to hide. He had not known about the letters. He had believed he had needed to believe that they were gone, that his quiet December departure had been enough, that the channel had been burned and Eleanor had no proof of it. Now he was looking at his own handwriting, 12 weeks of his own careful, professional, devastatingly specific handwriting, on a table in an imperial hall. He stood halfway out of his chair, then sat. The movement was small, involuntary. The movement of a body that has received information the mind has not processed yet. He looked at the letters. He looked at the back of Eleanor's head. He did not speak. Helena looked at Thomas Brandt. Her black eyes, which had priced everything they had ever rested on, took exactly 1 second to read his posture. 1 second to trace back from his posture to the letters on the table, to Eleanor standing at the front of the hall, to the timeline of what that implied about what Eleanor had known and when. And then something happened to Helena Voss's face. Not rage, not tears, not the dramatic collapse of a person who has been revealed and is processing the revelation emotionally. Helena was not that person. Had never been that person. What happened was quieter than all of those, and worse. The specific blankness. The 3 seconds where the calculation that had never stopped running, the constant 40-year assessment of weights and values and leverages and angles of approach simply stopped. Because there was nothing to calculate anymore. Her hand moved, slightly, barely visible, toward the arm of the woman standing beside her. Not intentional, not chosen. The movement of a body looking for something to hold on to when the thing it has always stood on is no longer there. She pulled it back in under 2 seconds. But the hall had been watching. The hall had seen it. Helena's advocate, who was very good at his job and had earned his fee on many previous occasions, did what good advocates do when they are losing a position they believed was secured. He pivoted. "Your Majesty," still smooth, still composed. The ledgers being presented as evidence derived from a provincial steward of no formal standing, no official credentialing, no audit oversight. There is no established chain of custody for these documents. They cannot be authenticated through normal judicial channels. It is entirely possible, it is in fact more than possible, that they were produced or modified specifically for this purpose. A beat, which was admittedly not a terrible argument. It was the argument, the only remaining structural challenge available to him. And he had made it cleanly. Eleanor nodded to the court usher at the side entrance. The door opened, and Marta Heil walked in. She was wearing her good dress, the one she kept for church, dark wool, well maintained in the way of someone who respects things, not because they are expensive, but because they matter. Her hands were at her sides. The calluses were visible. The hands of a woman who has spent her life in outdoor work and has never once considered that this was something to apologize for. She entered the Imperial Hall the way she entered every room she had ever entered, by walking forward and looking at what was in front of her, not intimidated, not performing unintimidation, simply present. The hall received her with the kind of silence that happens when an expected sequence encounters an unexpected element, and the entire mechanism pauses to recalibrate. A woman from Brunwald, in an imperial audience chamber, in her church dress. Eleanor said, clearly Johann Heil served as steward of Brunwald Estate for 22 years, until his death in 1858. This is his daughter, Marta. She has maintained his ledgers since his death. She will speak to their origin and their preservation. The advocate recovered. Your Majesty, he said. The smoothness slightly strained now, like a road that has been maintained perfectly until this particular section. A private individual's informal testimony. The Ministry of Imperial Properties, Eleanor said, before he could finish the sentence, maintains its own production records for all estates under Imperial Trust oversight. Those records, copies of which are in Section 1 of the dossier, confirm the yield figures in Johann Heil's ledgers, year for year, field by field, every entry, for the full 22 years of his tenure. She paused. If the advocate would identify a specific year and specific field section for direct comparison, I can facilitate that review immediately. In this room, today. She looked at him. He looked at the dossier. He looked at the Emperor. We have the time, said Emperor Karl IV. And the advocate had nothing. Nothing left to place on the table. Marta spoke for 7 minutes. She stood in the middle of the Imperial Hall in her church dress and spoke about her father the way she spoke about everything, directly, without decoration, without asking the room for its permission first. She said his name was Johann Heil. He was steward at Brunwald for 22 years. He was not educated in the way that universities confer, but he understood numbers the way some people understand land. Instinctively, completely. He believed, she said, that numbers were a form of honesty, that writing them down correctly was a moral act as much as an administrative one. She said he kept those ledgers every year, every season, every entry with the same care he would have given a sacred text. Not because anyone required it, not because anyone was checking, because the truth documented properly belonged to the future, even when the present could not use it yet. She said she had kept them after his death, because they were his, because she did not throw away things that mattered to people she loved. She said she had not known, until Eleanor explained it 2 years ago, what they contained or what they could mean. But her father had known, or had known enough. He had told her, keep them. Someone will need them. Someone always needs a true account eventually. The hall was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the floor for a moment, then at Marta, and in Marta's face, which was not performing anything, which was simply there, simply honest, simply the face of a woman who came here to tell the truth about her father, and has done so. Eleanor saw the entire shape of the 3 years. The barn school, the East Field, the Saturday mornings with chalk and children, and the specific belief that understanding is available to anyone if someone creates the conditions for it. The nights in the locked office with the notebooks and the letters and the ledgers, and the long, methodical patience of building something that cannot be taken apart. All of it coming back in the form of a woman in a church dress, standing in an imperial hall, speaking plainly about a dead man's faith that the truth could wait and eventually be found. It can only wait. The ministry's records confirmed every figure, year by year, field by field. Not because Eleanor had arranged for them to confirm it, because Johann Heil had written the truth down carefully for 22 years, and the truth written down carefully matches the truth written down elsewhere, because that is what truth does. It took 3 hours. Not a verdict, not a sentencing. The wheels of imperial administration do not turn that way, but a determination sufficient evidence to refer the matter of the Ashbourne Trust accounts to the Ministry of Justice for formal investigation. The forged documents refer to the same ministry with a request for identification of their origin. The correspondence between Brandt and Voss entered into the official record. Emperor Karl thanked Lady Ashbourne for the comprehensiveness of her documentation. He said it directly, without ornament, as a fact, which it was. Helena left before the session formally closed. She walked out of the hall with the posture of a woman who has not been defeated, because that was the last thing she controlled. The posture, the chin angle, the specific quality of her exit, not hurried, not crumbling, not permitting the room to watch her process what had just happened. She walked out, and the door closed, and the room after a moment moved on, because that is what rooms do, even imperial halls. They move on. The honorary positions Helena held in various imperial charitable and advisory bodies were reviewed over the following 6 weeks, retired one by one with the careful administrative language that means this is being managed quietly, so that the institution does not look bad, but it is being managed completely. She withdrew to a property in Hungary. Her correspondence, which had for 40 years been the mechanism of everything, the social information gathering, the alliance maintenance, the quiet campaigns, the unsigned letters with the unmistakable wax seal, slowed. Then slowed further. Then stopped. The people who had relied on her for favors found other mechanisms. People who need systems are not loyal to the people inside the systems. They are loyal to the access. When the access closes, they find another door. The salons forgot her. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. They simply began having other conversations. Because salons are not capable of loyalty either. They run on novelty and proximity to power. And Helena in Hungary offered neither. She died on a winter morning in 1875. The salons did not mark the absence, which was for someone who had spent 40 years being indispensable, the most comprehensive possible answer to the question of what she had actually built. The declaration happened at Brunwald, not in Vienna. not in any room that had witnessed or been constructed to receive significance. In the East Field on a February morning in 1868, with the last of the winter mud doing what Styrian winter mud does in February, which is everything. Casimir had arrived the day before. No announcement. No ministry business. His presence here had no ministerial pretense anymore, which was a relief to both of them. He had been walking the East Field since early morning. She could see him from the study window, the way he moved across it, the small limp on the uneven ground, the way he stopped at certain points and looked at the soil the way she had taught him to look at it without realizing she was teaching him. She went out to meet him. The mud was significant. Her boots were immediately in it. She had very good boots. Had for 3 years now. He turned when she was 10 feet away. His expression had the quality it always had when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. The particular stillness of a man who does not speak until he is certain. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I want to say." And she said, "And I've been thinking about it since the library." When you turned your face away for a moment. A pause, short. "You thought I didn't notice. I noticed you noticed," she said. "Then you know I know what you noticed. I don't know what you made of it." He looked at the field for a moment, then back at her. "I made this of it," he said. "I have known people who built things, roads, institutions, political structures that outlasted them. I thought I understood what building was." He stopped, looked at the mud on his boots, then at her. "You built a person, while no one was watching, while they were watching for you to disappear." He said it with the exactness of someone who has been carrying the sentence for a long time and has finally found the right place to put it down. I find I cannot look away from that. And I have tried. For practical reasons, I have tried. She looked at him. He was standing in Styrian February mud, in a ministerial coat that was already beyond repair, with silver at his temples and a limp that showed on uneven ground and gray-green eyes that had been asking her real questions since the first afternoon in the East Field. She thought of the drawer, the letters inside it, the appendix of a Rhine Valley agricultural history, the word anyway in a room with a fire burning low. She thought of her own voice saying, "I need to be ready first." She had been ready, she realized, for some time. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." I said yes. She looked at the field. The East Field, which had been unusable when she arrived and was now in February mud already showing the early structure of what it would be in spring. "Not to you." First. She looked back at him. "I said yes to this, to myself, in the first winter, when I decided to stop auditing the losses and start building what was possible." A pause. I needed to say yes to myself first, before I could mean it when I said it to anyone else. He was quiet. And now he said, and now she said, "I know the difference." A pause. Yes. He did not move for a moment. Then he said, "I also have something to tell you." "What?" "You have mud on your coat." "I always have mud on my coat." "Yes," he said. "I know. I find I like that about you specifically." Eleanor Ashbourne, who was 35 years old and had built a functioning estate and a successful legal case, and a barn school and a drainage system, and a dossier that had stood up in an imperial hall looked at Casimir Aldrin, standing in her east field in ruined boots, and laughed. Not the contained, managed sound that was all she had allowed herself in Vienna. Actually laughed. The kind that is mostly surprise. The kind that says I had forgotten this was possible. Being this specific kind of not alone. He looked at her laughing, and his expression did something she had not seen on it before, which was simply happy. Brunwald, May 1878. 10 years since she said yes not to Casimir, but to herself in a frozen field with mud on her boots, and no one watching. The orchard was completely in bloom. Apple blossoms in the kind of abundance that only happens when the previous winter has been exactly the right kind of cold and the soil has been managed correctly for several years. White flowers everywhere. The smell of it clean and sweet and temporary in the way that beautiful things are always temporary, and that is part of what makes them beautiful. Eleanor was 46. Her hair had silver in it now. Not dabbling the way it had been 2 years ago, committed. At the temples and threaded through the auburn, which had not given up entirely and which she suspected never entirely would. The birthmark along her right cheek had lightened at the edges over years of Styrian sun, become less defined, more simply part of the face she had, which was her face, always had been. Always would be. The main house had been repaired properly 8 years ago, solid and warm and lit in the evenings in a way that the first winter version of Eleanor would not have thought possible. The east field was green, had been green reliably for 7 years. Hass's drainage work held up every spring, because good work done properly does. The barn school had moved into a real building 6 years ago. Stone. 2 rooms. A teacher Eleanor had trained and who had now developed her own methods and who had opinions about those methods that were sometimes different from Eleanor's and always worth discussing. 40 children enrolled currently. A waiting list for next year. The Vienna school had 120 women per year. Government funded for 4 years. 2 buildings. A board of governors that Eleanor still attended quarterly, though the director now was a woman named Therese, who had been one of the first 12 students and who ran it with a competence Eleanor found genuinely humbling and also correct. The things she had started were continuing without her, which was the point. Casimir came out the side door with a letter. 52 years old, silver-haired now in a way that was no longer at the temples, but simply committed throughout. The limp barely visible on the flat courtyard, but present on the orchard slope which he had stopped minimizing somewhere in the 5th year of walking these grounds. Ministry, he said. I know which one, she said. You haven't answered it. I'll answer it this week. He stood beside her, looking at the orchard. The way they stood together in places which was without requiring anything of the silence. The silence of 2 people who have said everything they needed to say and discovered that the quiet on the other side of that is not empty. It is full. From somewhere behind the old cellar building, a voice. Clara. 8 years old. The same auburn hair that went everywhere. The amber eyes that had Eleanor still thought an unfair amount of her own stubbornness installed in them. Ernst, you are wrong. There are 4. Ernst. 10 years old. The silver-gray eyes that were Casimir's and the jaw that was entirely Eleanor's, and the specific expression of a boy who knows he has made an error and is calculating the fastest route to seeming like he knew this all along. "For what?" said Casimir. "Eggs. Nest in the old barn. Clara is reporting with complete urgency. Is she wrong about the count?" "No," said Eleanor. "Ernst undercounted. How do you know you haven't seen them?" She looked at him. "Ernst," she said. He considered this. "Fair," he said. Clara appeared at the edge of the orchard with the energy of a child who has been right and needs witnesses immediately. "Mama." 4. I counted twice, each time. 4. Is the mother bird upset? Clara considered the ethics of this. "Somewhat," she said. "Then we leave them alone until tomorrow." Clara's face went through the full negotiation. Discovery versus responsibility. The wanting to look again versus the understanding that the mother bird's feelings were a legitimate consideration. She landed on responsibility, the way she usually did when the logic was explained. "Fine," she said, then turned back toward the barn where Ernst was now attempting to look like he had been planning to confirm the count all along. Ernst, Clara called. "Come help me count the other one I found by the fence." He followed her, without arguing, which was new and promising. Eleanor walked back toward the house to find the ministry letter and write her answer. She found it on the desk under the soil survey she had been reading that morning. Read it again. The Imperial Properties Conference in September. The topic this year is state management models as a framework for administrative reform across the empire. They wanted her to present Brunwald. Second invitation this year. Third in 3 years. She picked up the pen, wrote the response. "I accept. I will travel by train." Put the pen down. She walked back outside. The afternoon had the quality it gets in Brunwald in May, when the conditions are exactly right. The apple blossoms throw in that light. The earth warm enough underfoot to feel deliberate. The sky a particular blue that is not trying to be anything, just itself. She looked at the east field beyond the garden wall, green and solid, and exactly what it was supposed to be. At the aqueduct column visible from the upper field, the one with the small bronze plaque installed 6 years ago. Installed because the workers of Brunwald had asked for it, because they wanted the thing that had brought water to the east field to carry a name. Built by E. Ashbourne, water for those who stayed. Marta had suggested the wording. Marta was at Brunwald 3 days a week now, running the regional consultation program Eleanor had established 4 years ago, a practical training system for estate managers from other properties who came to learn the methodology, who spent 2 weeks walking the fields and reviewing the notebooks and understanding from the inside how a system of honest observation applied over time becomes something that cannot be manufactured, can only be grown. Marta ran it the way she ran everything, with full attention, with no false praise, with the specific authority of someone who knows the ground better than the books that describe it. The children of the barn school had always wanted most to impress Marta with their arithmetic, because Marta's approval was not decorative. When she said a thing was correct, it was correct. They understood the difference. Eleanor understood the difference too. She heard Clara's voice from the direction of the fence, announcing something new, something Ernst was being required to acknowledge. She heard Ernst's voice, acknowledging it, after a pause, but acknowledging. In the distance, the bronze plaque caught the afternoon light. She stood in the orchard and thought about what gets built in the dark, in the cold, when there is no audience and no approval and no one watching to confirm that what you are doing has any value. She thought about what you find out about yourself in those conditions, not built, revealed. The thing that was always there, that the noise of everything else, the salon conversations, the assessments, the marks in the margin of your worth had been covering. The thing that does not need the room to look at it to be real. Then she walked toward the sound of her children, with the steps of someone who knows every inch of this ground, because she built it, herself, in the silence, when no one was looking.